Imagine you wake up tomorrow and your country simply ceases to exist. Your language is banned, your temples are destroyed, your history is erased. Foreign invaders have taken everything: the government, the economy, even the name of your people. What would you do? For most civilizations in history, that would be the end. A people without land, without language, without identity. Forgotten forever. But that happened to Iran not once, not twice, but 7 times over 5,000 years. Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Turks. And every single time a new conqueror arrived thinking they had destroyed this people, Iran came back with the same language, the same poetry, the same unbreakable spirit. How does a people do that? That's what you're going to find out in the next 18 minutes. And I promise you, when this video ends, you will look at the Middle East in a completely different way. Stay until the end, because the most surprising part of this story isn't the glorious beginning. It's what happened in the 20th century, a turning point that nobody saw coming, and one that still shapes the world you live in today. Let's go. Before the name Iran ever existed, before the concept of Persia, there was already life on the Iranian plateau. We're talking about 30,000 years ago. Human communities were already organizing themselves there, farming, trading, building, and around 3,200 BC. At the same time, Egypt was raising its first pyramids. A powerful civilization consolidated itself in the southwest of what is now Iran. Its name, Elam. Elam's capital was Susa, a city you've probably never heard of, but one that was for nearly 2,000 years one of the most important centers in the ancient world. The Elamites created their own writing systems, built monumental temples, and traded with the great powers of Mesopotamia: the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. 2,000 years of history. 2,000 years of continuous civilization. And then, in 646 BC, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal invaded Susa, sacked the city, and destroyed everything he could. Elam had fallen. But the fall of Elam wasn't the end of Iranian history. It was just the end of the first chapter. While Elam was collapsing in the southwest, something was moving in from the east. Indo-Iranian tribes were descending from the steppes of Central Asia toward the plateau. They were nomadic peoples, warriors, horsemen. And when they arrived in Iran, they didn't simply replace the local populations. They mixed with them, settled among them, and gradually formed new societies. 2 groups stood out: the Medes and the Persians. The Medes were the first to build an organized kingdom in the 7th century BC. They unified scattered tribes under a central authority, and for a moment seemed to be the future of the region. But it was the Persians, their neighbors to the south, who would change the world. In 559 BC, a man took the throne of the small Persian kingdom of Anshan, in what is now the Fars province of southwestern Iran. His name was Cyrus, and over the next 30 years, this man would build the largest empire the world had ever seen. Cyrus started small. His kingdom was modest, surrounded by bigger powers. But Cyrus had something that most conquerors in history lacked. He knew how to win not just battles, but hearts. In 550 BC, he defeated the Median king Astyages and unified the Iranian peoples under his leadership. Then he turned west and conquered Lydia, the kingdom famous for its fabulous wealth and its king Croesus. Then he moved south and took Babylon, one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. And here's the detail that separates Cyrus from almost every other conqueror in history. When he entered Babylon in 539 BC, he didn't sack the city. He didn't destroy the temples. He didn't enslave the people. He told them they could keep living the way they always had. More than that, he freed every people the Babylonians had kept in captivity, including the Jews, who returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt their temple. That's why the Hebrew Bible calls Cyrus the Lord's Anointed, a title reserved for the greatest of leaders. This principle of tolerance was recorded on an object that today sits in the British Museum in London, the Cyrus Cylinder. A small clay cylinder describing Cyrus's policies of respect for local religions and the restoration of displaced peoples. Many historians call it one of the earliest declarations of human rights in history. Iran, at its very first great moment, wasn't just military force. It was also an idea. After Cyrus, his successors kept expanding the empire. Cambyses II conquered Egypt, and then came Darius I, perhaps the greatest administrator in all of ancient history. Under Darius, the Achaemenid Empire reached its peak, 5.5 million square kilometers, from Egypt to India, from Greece to Central Asia. 46 different peoples living under a single banner. To govern all of that, Darius created a system that was a marvel for its time. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each with its own governor. He built long-distance roads connecting distant corners of the empire. The most famous of them, the Royal Road, stretched over 1,700 miles and allowed messages to travel from one end to the other in under 2 weeks. He standardized weights, measures, and the taxation system. And he built Persepolis. If you've never seen photos of the ruins of Persepolis, pause this video right now and look them up. Even in ruins, even destroyed, they're breathtaking. It was an imperial capital where ambassadors from Egypt, Greece, and India came to present tribute, their traditional clothing carved into the stone staircases for eternity. For nearly 2 centuries, Persia was the center of the known world. And then a 25-year-old arrived with a Macedonian army, Alexander the Great. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia. By 330 BC, just 4 years later, the Achaemenid Empire had collapsed. Persepolis was burned. The last Persian king, Darius III, fled and was assassinated by his own generals. Alexander declared himself the new king of Persia. 200 years of civilization, destroyed in 4. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his vast empire was divided among his generals. Control of Persia fell to Seleucus I Nicator, founder of the Seleucid Empire. For nearly a century, Iran lived under Greek rule. Greek cities were founded. The Greek language spread. Hellenistic culture blended with Persian. But something persisted beneath the surface. The Iranian identity had not been destroyed. It was just waiting. In the mid-3rd century BC, a new power began rising in northeastern Iran. The Parthians, originally a nomadic Iranian people called the Parni from Central Asia, settled in the region of Parthia and began expanding their control, taking advantage of the Seleucid Empire's weakening grip on its eastern territories. Around 247 BC, Arsaces I declared independence. His dynasty, the Arsacids, would rule Iran for nearly 500 years. The Parthian Empire became Rome's great eastern rival. They stopped Roman expansion in epic battles, like the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus was completely annihilated by Parthian horsemen. They controlled the trade routes linking the Mediterranean to China, what would later be called the Silk Road. They were Iranians, but they had absorbed both Greek and Central Asian culture. They were a people of fusion, of synthesis. And then, in 224 AD, everything changed again. A Persian nobleman named Ardashir rebelled against the last Parthian king and defeated him in battle. the Sasanian Empire was born, and with the Sasanians, Iran once again became what it had been in the time of Cyrus and Darius, a centralized, proud, imperial power. Zoroastrianism, the religion of the ancient Persians, one of the oldest in the world, was established as the official state religion. Art, architecture, and scholarship flourished. The Sasanians created a sophisticated culture that would profoundly influence both the Islamic world and medieval Western Europe. But they also inherited an old problem: Rome. For over 400 years, Persia and Rome went to war. At one point, the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian king Shapur I, the only time in history that a living Roman emperor fell prisoner to a foreign enemy. The scene was immortalized in rock carvings that still exist in Iran today. But the most devastating war of all was the last one. From 602 to 628 A.D., Byzantium and Persia tore each other apart in a conflict that lasted 26 years. At first, the Persians won. They seized Jerusalem and Egypt. Then, Byzantine Emperor Heraclius counterattacked, and the Persians fell back. Then the Persians pushed again. When it finally ended, both empires were exhausted. No money, no soldiers, no strength. And it was precisely at that moment that something emerged from the deserts of Arabia that nobody had predicted. In 632 A.D., the Prophet Muhammad died in Medina. His followers, united by the new faith of Islam, began expanding across the desert. In the years that followed, they conquered territories that had taken Roman armies decades to subdue. In 636 A.D., at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the Arab army faced the Persians. Persia, still weakened from decades of war against Byzantium, lost. In 642 A.D., at the Battle of Nihavand, which the Arabs called the Victory of Victories, the heart of the Sasanian Empire was destroyed. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled east. In 651 A.D., he was killed by a simple miller. 5 centuries of Sasanian dynasty ended with a fugitive king murdered by an ordinary man. Iran had fallen. But here's what's fascinating. And this is where Iran's story separates itself from every other people conquered by Islam. Unlike Egypt, which lost its Coptic language, unlike Mesopotamia, which forgot Aramaic, unlike North Africa, which abandoned Berber, Iran kept its language. Persian survived. It adapted, absorbed Arabic words, began being written in the Arabic script, but it remained Persian. It remained recognizable. It remained the vessel of a millennia-old identity. And more than that, the Persians didn't just get conquered by Islam. They became Islam's greatest intellectuals, poets, administrators, and scientists. The centuries following the fall of the Sasanians are known to historians as the Islamic Golden Age, and Iran was at the center of it. Avicenna ibn Sina was born in what is now Uzbekistan, but wrote in Persian and Arabic. His canon of medicine was the most important medical textbook in the world for 600 years, used in European universities well into the 17th century. Al-Biruni catalogued plant species, calculated the circumference of the earth with stunning accuracy, and described Indian culture with a scientific rigor that was centuries ahead of its time. Omar Khayyam, before writing his famous Rubaiyat, those poems about wine, love, and the impermanence of life, was one of the greatest mathematicians of his era, contributing to algebra and calculating the solar year with a precision that wouldn't be surpassed until the 20th century. Ferdowsi, the greatest epic poet in the Persian language, spent 30 years of his life writing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a poem of 60,000 verses narrating the mythical and historical story of Iran. When the Abbasid Caliphate stopped using Persian as an official language, Ferdowsi almost single-handedly kept alive the language of Cyrus and Darius. The Arab conquerors had seized political power. But culturally, who had conquered whom? In the 11th century, a new power emerged from the steppes of Central Asia. The Seljuks were Turks who had converted to Islam and served as military commanders for the Abbasid Caliphate. Gradually, they seized real power, while the caliphs became ceremonial figures. Under the Seljuks, much of the Iranian world experienced political stability after centuries of fragmentation. And although the ruling elite was Turkic, the language they adopted for administration, literature, and scholarship was Persian. Once again, Iran had been conquered. Once again, the Persian language had conquered its conquerors. And then, in the early 13th century, came the greatest nightmare Iran had ever faced: the Mongols. In 1220, the armies of Genghis Khan swept across Central Asia into Iran. What happened next was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. Entire cities were destroyed. Nishapur, one of the greatest cultural centers in the Islamic world, was sacked and its population massacred. Merv suffered the same fate. Historical estimates suggest the Mongol invasion may have killed between a third and half of Iran's entire population. Irrigation systems that had taken generations to build were destroyed in days. Libraries holding centuries of knowledge were burned. Communities that had flourished for 1,000 years vanished from history. For any other civilization, this would have been the end. But here's what happened next. In the mid-13th century, Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan, established a Mongol state in Iran called the Ilkhanate. The Mongols, who had destroyed everything, began to rule. And in ruling, they began to be absorbed. The first Ilkhan to convert to Islam was Tekuder. But the real turning point came in 1295, when Ghazan Khan converted and declared Islam the official religion of the Ilkhanate. Within decades, the Mongols who had destroyed Iran were building Persian mosques, patronizing Persian poets, administering in Persian. History was repeating itself once more. The conquerors had been conquered by the culture. The Ilkhanate collapsed after the death of Abu Sa'id Bahadur Khan in 1335. Without a strong successor, Iran fragmented again into smaller states fighting for power. And then, in the late 14th century, came Timur. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, was a Central Asian military leader who built one of the largest empires in history through a combination of tactical brilliance and extreme violence. His campaigns through Iran left a trail of destroyed cities and massacred populations that rivaled the Mongols. But here's history's irony. Timur loved Persian culture. His sons and grandsons, the Timurids, became some of the greatest patrons of Persian art, literature, and architecture in history. Cities like Samarkand and Herat flourished as major centers of Persian culture. The illuminated manuscripts produced under the Timurids are among the most beautiful works of art ever created by human hands. A conqueror who destroyed cities also funded one of the greatest cultural renaissances in the Islamic world. Iran, once again, had found a way to survive. In 1501, a 14-year-old teenager changed Iran forever. His name was Ismail. He was the leader of a Sufi order called the Safavids, with a dangerous combination of religious fervor, political ambition, and military genius. In less than a decade, he had unified Iran under his rule. But Ismail didn't just do that. He did something that would separate Iran from virtually the entire Islamic world around it. He declared Twelver Shia Islam, the branch that believes in 12 divine imams, the official religion of the state. This was revolutionary. At the time, the overwhelming majority of the Muslim world was Sunni. The Ottoman Empire to the west, the Islamic superpower of the age, was Sunni. The Uzbeks to the east were Sunni. Overnight, Iran became a Shia island in a Sunni ocean. Why did Ismail do it? Part was genuine faith. Part was political strategy. Create a distinct identity that separated Iran from its powerful neighbors and forged a national unity around a unique religious identity. It worked. The Safavid Empire became one of the most powerful and brilliant in Islamic history. And under Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1588 to 1629, Iran experienced its most glorious moment since the Achaemenids. The capital Isfahan was transformed into one of the most magnificent cities in the world. If you ever visit Isfahan, and you should, you will stand before Naqshi Jahan Square, one of the largest public squares on earth, surrounded by the Imam Mosque, the Ali Kapu Palace, and the Grand Bazaar. Shah Abbas built all of it. It was barely 200 years old when it was completed, but it looks like it grew from the earth 1,000 years ago. Trade flourished. The arts reached new heights. Persian carpets, miniature paintings, the architecture of brick and turquoise tile. All of it reached perfection under the Safavids. And then, as always, the decline. In the early 18th century, the Safavid Empire began to come apart. Internal corruption, economic difficulties, external pressure from Ottomans and Uzbeks. In 1722, Afghan forces invaded and sacked Isfahan. For a brief moment, a military genius named Nader Shah restored Iranian power. In 1739, he invaded India, something no Iranian ruler had done since the days of Darius I, and returned carrying the wealth of Delhi, including the legendary Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The campaign was so profitable that Nader abolished taxes in Iran for 3 years. But Nader was paranoid, violent, and his empire collapsed shortly after his death. In the late 18th century, the Qajar dynasty took power, and it was here that Iran met a new kind of enemy, different from anything it had faced before. Not a conqueror. Something more subtle, more insidious. European imperialism. The Russian Empire was expanding southward, seizing territories in the Caucasus that had been Persian for centuries. The treaties of Galistan in 1813 and Turkmenchay in 1828 forced Iran to give up enormous swaths of territory, including what is now Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. At the same time, the British Empire pressed from the south, working to ensure Iran never grew strong enough to threaten its most prized colonial possession, India. Iran was never formally colonized, but it was trapped between two empires that controlled its foreign policy, granted themselves special economic rights, and treated the country as a chessboard for their own interests. And then, in the early 20th century, something was discovered beneath the Iranian soil that would complicate everything even further: oil. In 1901, a British businessman named William Knox Darcy obtained a concession from the Iranian government to explore for oil across nearly the entire country. In 1908, oil was found. In 1909, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was founded. The profits from Iranian oil enriched Britain. Iran received a tiny fraction. That was the state of affairs when the Iranian people decided they had had enough. In 1906, something extraordinary happened. The Iranian people rose up, not with swords, not with armies, but with a demand for a constitution. The Constitutional Revolution of 1906 was a unique moment in the history of the Middle East. After intense popular protest, the Shah was forced to sign a constitution and create a parliament, the Majlis. For the first time in 5,000 years of history, Iran would have a government limited by law. It was an epic shift. A people who had lived under pharaohs, emperors, and shahs for millennia were now demanding representation. But empires don't let their pawns escape that easily. With backing from Britain and Russia, the Shah crushed the movement. Constitutional leaders were arrested, exiled, or executed. In 1911, the Majlis was bombarded by Russian cannons. The window had closed, but the memory didn't disappear. In 1925, a former military officer named Reza Khan staged a coup and founded the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah, as he came to be known, was obsessed with modernization. He looked at what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was doing in Turkey and wanted the same for Iran. He built railroads, created universities, established a modern army, opened schools for women, forced men to wear European-style hats instead of turbans, banned the veil in public. And in 1935, he did something symbolic but profound. He asked the world to stop calling his country Persia and use the name his own people had always used, Iran, land of the Aryans. But Reza Shah made one fatal mistake. During World War II, he tried to play the great powers against each other and showed too much sympathy toward Nazi Germany, hoping Hitler might counterbalance British and Soviet influence. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate. He was put on a ship and exiled. He would die in South Africa in 1944. Left on the throne was his 22-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The young Shah started weak, governing under enormous foreign pressure. In 1951, an event shook Iran and the world. Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister. He was a soft-spoken politician who sometimes conducted interviews from his bed due to health problems and who looked more like a professor than a political leader. But he had one simple, explosive idea. Iran's oil belongs to Iran. Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He seized control of Iran's oil industry from British hands. The world watched in disbelief. It was the first time a Middle Eastern country had dared to take control of its own natural resources from a Western power. Britain responded with economic sanctions and a global oil boycott. When Mossadegh refused to back down, Britain went knocking on Washington's door. In August 1953, the CIA and British intelligence launched Operation Ajax. A coup. Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah, who had fled the country days earlier, returned to the throne with far more power than he had ever held. The United States had chosen oil over democracy. The Iranian people would not forget. With American backing, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi ruled Iran as a reliable Western ally throughout the Cold War. American military aid flowed into the country. Iran purchased enormous quantities of Western weapons and became one of the largest military powers in the Middle East. But internally, the contradictions were piling up. Savak, the feared secret police created with American and Israeli help, monitored, arrested, tortured, and killed dissidents. Journalists, intellectuals, communists, Islamists, anyone who dared criticize the regime took their life in their hands. At the same time, the Shah launched the White Revolution, a modernization program that redistributed land, industrialized the economy, and expanded women's rights. The macroeconomic numbers looked good, but wealth was concentrating. The elite was getting richer, while the poor in cities and villages were being left behind. And in 1971, the Shah made a mistake that would live in Iranian memory for decades. He spent a staggering fortune, estimates reach $300 million, to celebrate 2,500 years of Persian monarchy at the ruins of Persepolis. Kings, queens, and presidents from around the world were invited. Luxury tents were erected. Tons of food were imported from France, while parts of Iran still lived in poverty. The message the Shah wanted to send was one of imperial grandeur. The message that reached the Iranian people was something very different. And there was one man in exile who knew exactly how to use that anger. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was not a conventional politician. He was a severe Islamic cleric, white beard, piercing gaze, who had spent years studying Islamic philosophy and developing a radical political theory that government should belong not to a Shah or an elected president, but to an Islamic jurist, a religious scholar qualified to interpret the law of God. Khomeini had been criticizing the Shah openly since the 1960s. In 1964, he was expelled from the country. He lived in exile in Iraq, then in France, near Paris. But from exile, he found a modern weapon that previous revolutionaries hadn't had: the audio cassette. His sermons were recorded and smuggled into Iran by the thousands. In mosques, in homes, in bazaar storerooms, people gathered to hear the Ayatollah's gravelly voice denouncing the Shah as an American puppet, calling for a system based on Islamic justice and national independence. His message reached every corner of society. Traditional religious people who hated the Shah's forced modernization, left-wing students who despised Savak's repression, bazaar merchants who resented the concentration of power in the hands of a Western-aligned elite, urban poor who felt the white revolution had never reached them. In 1978, protests exploded. Month after month, demonstrations grew. The Shah tried repression. Soldiers shot protesters in multiple cities across the country. It only fueled more rage. He tried concessions, appointed new prime ministers, promised reforms. Too late. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, ally of the United States, heir to 25 centuries of Persian monarchy, boarded a plane and left his country. He would never return. 2 weeks later, on February 1, 1979, Khomeini's plane landed in Tehran. Millions of people poured into the streets. Some say it was the largest gathering of human beings around a single individual in recorded history. In April 1979, following a national referendum, the Islamic Republic of Iran was proclaimed. 5,000 years of history. And once again, everything had changed. The new Islamic Republic was unlike anything that had ever existed before. It wasn't a simple theocracy like the Vatican. It wasn't a conventional democracy. It was a complex combination of popular elections for president and parliament, combined with religious oversight exercised by the supreme leader, the most powerful position in the system. Khomeini assumed that role, and immediately the new republic faced existential crises. In November 1979, radical students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 diplomats hostage. The hostages were held for 444 days. A crisis that destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency and cemented decades of hostility between Iran and the United States. And then, in September 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years. It was one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. Chemical weapons, mustard gas, sarin, were used by Saddam against Iranian soldiers and civilians. The Iranian death toll likely reached 300,000. Some studies suggest it may have exceeded 500,000. The war created an entire generation of Iranians scarred by trauma. But here's something that few people outside of Iran know. For Iranians, that war is called the sacred defense. Young Iranians, some as young as 13 or 14, volunteered to go to the front. They wore plastic keys around their necks, keys to paradise, as they were called, a symbol that they were willing to die for their country and their faith. The war ended in 1988, with no significant territorial changes. A devastating stalemate. In 1989, Khomeini died. Leadership passed to Ali Khamenei, who still governed Iran into the 2000s. In the decades following Khomeini's death, Iran navigated turbulent waters. Under reformist presidents like Mohammad Khatami in the 1990s, there were attempts at opening, greater press freedom, dialogue with the West, gradual social reforms. But the Iranian political system, divided between elected power and the supreme leader's authority, frequently blocked those reforms. Under Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in the 2000s, Iran adopted a far more confrontational posture, expanding its nuclear program, openly challenging the West, becoming the target of increasingly severe economic sanctions. In 2015, after years of negotiations, the Iran nuclear deal, officially the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was signed between Iran and the world's major powers. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. For 3 years, it seemed like a new chapter might be starting. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement unilaterally. Sanctions returned, heavier than before. Iran's economy collapsed. Inflation soared. Unemployment surged, and the Iranian people, squeezed between a government that restricted their freedoms and sanctions that crushed their economy, continued expressing their frustration in waves of protest. 2019, 2022, and beyond. Iran's story had not ended. It never ends. In 2025, negotiations between Iran and the United States resumed. The world watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism. It wasn't the first time these two countries had tried to find a path forward. And then, in 2026, Ali Khamenei died. The man who had ruled Iran for over 30 years, who had survived wars, sanctions, revolutions, and crises, was gone. He left behind a complex, contradictory, fascinating country. One of the youngest populations in the Middle East, with a vibrant civil society and 5,000 years of history weighing on every decision. Who would come next? Which direction would Iran take? Nobody knows. But if there's one lesson that 5,000 years of Iranian history teaches, it's this: Iran always surprises. Iran always survives. And always, one way or another, finds a way to be Iran. From Cyrus the Great, who freed the enslaved and wrote one of history's first human rights documents, to Ali Khamenei, who ruled an Islamic republic for decades, from Elam to the Achaemenids, from the Parthians to the Sasanians, from the Arabs to the Mongols, from the Safavids to the Pahlavis, 5,000 years of invasions, collapses, and rebirths. 5,000 years of a language that refuses to die. 5,000 years of poetry, art, and identity. That is Iran. A country that shouldn't exist, but does. That shouldn't have survived, but survived. If this video made you see Iran differently, if you feel like this story deserves to be more widely known, share it with someone. Hit the like button, and let me know in the comments. Which moment in Iranian history surprised you the most? See you in the next one.